The Lighthouse is a story of individuality. It explores aspects of identity and how the workplace dampens it. The story is set at the beginning of Marxist thinking, and I feel like it's important to think about why they chose this time period, and not just because that it was based on a real story, but because the Lighthouse is such a prominent and yet short part of our history, part of American history. And the fact that it brings in Herman Melville and all those other American authors about hard work at sea, and that at this time, work became something more than just something you did, something you wanted to do to get by, something that you wanted to do because you enjoyed it, because it was a craft of yours. No, it became something that you had to do. And once you had to do it, it became your identity. It became something more than you. And because of that, you lost you. And so I wanted to talk about Marxism and how that plays into the idea of identity and how the Lighthouse really tackles that. So I feel like if you're going to watch this video, you need to keep in mind the time period and what identity means to you, and whether work affects your identity. And I want you to keep these in mind as you watch this video. And just really tackle your ideas of what workplace is, what identity is, and see if you can make that connection with the Lighthouse, with yourself, and how you interact in society. Enjoy. The contradictions of capitalism. The Lighthouse is the story of capitalism, told at the precipice of Marxist thinking, looking out onto an oceanic future of oppression, stagnation, and a loss of individuality. The very system that keeps those in power with power and those without beneath is built upon a foundation of contradictions. It demands a trust in an ultimately flawed system.
I'll drop you down a few feet.
Easy!
Never been in better hands. Easy! Quit your flailing, lad!
I ain't!
You're! Keep still!
I am!
The Lighthouse begins as a seemingly simple story based on a true event of two lighthouse keepers in Wales, both named Thomas, who got stranded at a lighthouse station. Robert Pattinson's character, Ephraim Winslow, garners sympathy from the audience almost immediately as he works a grueling position under Willem Dafoe's character, Thomas Wake, a lighthouse keeper who is entirely unpleasant to have as a boss in virtually every way possible. This is Winslow's first job in lighthouse keeping, and it is clear from the beginning that he intends to be a star employee. Winslow often refers to the Lighthouse Manual, as he is new to the field, and like a good worker, he wants to follow the rules.
Man what don't drink best have his reasons.
Tainted, I understood it's against regulations, sir.
Did you?
I did, sir, from them's manual.
Didn't picture you a reading man.
Well, I ain't trying for trouble.
Then you do as I say. That's in your book, too.
Winslow at this point still has faith in the system. He continues reading the manual, as seen the very next day after this interaction. For Winslow, the existence of a manual means there are rules to follow for both he and his boss, and it is to be followed religiously. Wake too, though, has a book.
Just fine work, and you're making high marks in me logbook. Them's gospel.
This establishes in the film an inherent value assigned to Wake above Winslow, which is beyond logic, beyond established rule, beyond anything besides what the class system dictates. Boss is superior, worker is inferior. Winslow begins to recognize this indisputable nature of a capitalistic society, that his place in work is underneath the boot of the boss. It is as deafening as the lighthouse's blaring siren, the very siren that hurt his ears as he continued shoveling coal, as the manual lay open and neglected next to him. The film proceeds to show Winslow having a worse and worse time. The work was so grueling that even the actor Robert Pattinson had a terrible time imitating his job. Nonetheless, when Winslow and Wake spend their downtime getting to know each other, Wake admits that he thought Winslow's previous job in lumber would be far worse.
Can't say I blame you. I hearn tell about that life. Hard going. Work one man harder than two us, as they say. No, thank you.
The film doesn't necessarily depict the work of a lumberjack, but one could assume that due to the emphasis of how terrible Winslow's job is at the Lighthouse, it can't be much worse. However, Winslow does his duties and often just nods in response to Wake and does his bidding in at most quiet rage. To me, it seems that lumber was likely not much different from any other job Winslow has held before. This presents an interesting idea of how capitalism functions. Work is work, and it's terrible.
Just like any man. Just want to settle down quiet like with some earnings. I read someplace that a man could earn $630 or $1,000 a year. He tends a light far offshore. The further away, the more he earns. I read that. Now I says, work. Save my earnings. Sometime soon I'll raise my own roof. Somewhere up country. No one to tell me what for. And that's all.
Winslow is just biding his time, trying to keep his head down and make it through life. Winslow saying just like any man indicates that he believes that this is a universal truth, that everyone wants to find a job they can stand and lead a simple life. But the incessant contradictions of capitalism often presents obstacles for the worker, especially when the boss abuses his power to just feel powerful. Wake really flourishes with flaunting his power, as time after time, when Wake goes into his monologues about swabbing decks or long-winded sea curses, they are ultimately of little meaning. But when Winslow finally snaps at the end of the film, and is permitted one of those Christmas Vacation-esque rants, Wake again gets the last word in, a biting, pseudo-innocent remark.
You have a way with words, Tommy. Oh, damn you!
Identity, sexuality, and privacy. Modern society is perverse, not in spite of its Puritanism, or as if from a backlash provoked by its hypocrisy. It is in actual fact, and directly, perverse. Foucault, The History of Sexuality. The Lighthouse asks viewers the question of what is identity and when do you have it? Can you have it in the workplace? Is it in privacy, locked away in a desk or in a shed? Identity, according to Robert Eggers, was a guiding theme of the story when it was being developed, inspired by the Welsh story of the two stranded lighthouse keepers named Thomas. But the idea that they were both named Thomas struck a chord. I was like, okay, this is a movie about identity and can devolve into some weird, obscure places. The story begins with only one Thomas, as it is only later revealed that Winslow stole the identity of his boss in the lumber industry who died on the job. Yet, despite having two names, Wake only uses a nickname, Lad, which upsets Winslow, who likely wants to be called by his new name to better take on his new identity.
Thank you, lad.
Winslow. Ephraim Winslow. These last 2 weeks, I'd like it if you'd call me by my name.
Listen to me. Giving orders, lad.
Winslow.
All right. Suits me just as fine. Ephraim Winslow.
Later on, Wake easily switches to Tommy after Winslow's true name is revealed to him. It is clear that if identity is permitted in the workplace, it is controlled by the boss. Another form of control that Winslow quickly points out is the use of alcohol and how it keeps the workers in place.
Water goes quick, lad. Vanished. The only medicine is drink. Keeps them sailors happy, keeps them agreeable, keeps them calm, keeps them...
Stupid.
At that point in the story, Winslow was still adamant on maintaining his right to his own identity. The audacity, or the spirit as Wake refers to it, is still pervasive in Winslow. It hasn't quite yet been beaten out of him. However, Wake has easily slipped into the blissful ease of letting his work be his identity.
You see, she's the only situation want for me.
It is clear that Winslow doesn't allow his work to be his identity. He sees himself as a hard worker, but he is comfortable moving between industries, which makes him a curiosity.
Just like you said, I just had enough of trees, I guess. Since I left Dad, I done every kind of work that can pay a man. Some I ain't near proud of.
Drifter, eh?
No, just can't find a post I can take a real shine to, so I keep moving along. I ain't the kind to look back what's behind him, see?
For most, this form of identity is a balancing act. Either one accepts that you won't ever reach power and this is okay, or one falls into the trap of capitalism. The idea, in gaining power, you will gain peace, is the falsehood that keeps workers in the clutches of capitalism. But identity is more than just the workplace, right? An aspect of identity that the Lighthouse tackles is how sexuality can shape your identity and whether privacy can protect it. This film shows the consequences of disregarding the rights of privacy and exploring your sexuality.
Said you went mad. You made him mad. With the charm. The scrubs all trinket. And we're all I broke, see? See? Now I'm free. Now I'm free from the designs. Now I got it all figured out. Except what's the secret, Mr. Dick? Up there!
Foucault, in his essay The History of Sexuality, determines that sexuality is innate, rather than something done in protest. It is prevalent even in its dismissal. The idea of sex, according to Foucault, was shaped into something not to be spoken of, and only practiced in necessity by the 18th century. Sex was not something one simply judged, it was a thing one administered. It was in the nature of a public potential. It called for management procedures. It had to be charged of by analytical discourses. In the 18th century, sex became a police matter, in the full and strict sense given the term at the time. Not the repression of disorder, but an ordered maximization of collective and individual forces. Foucault. In the film, sex is often established via imagery, as something inherent, something human, and something animal. From the very first shot, the concept of sex as natural is solidified. Out of the foggy sea, the first defined image seen is that of a ship cutting through water. The image is very erotic, with its V shape, the tip of the ship mixing with the water, the gushy sea foam. You get the idea. When the mermaid totem first appears, it comes from a slit in the mattress, which is filled with a fiber that closely resembles pubic hair. Winslow's first decision in the film is to hide it away, not in the bedding, but in his pocket. This interesting choice of preserving his privacy and his sexuality serves as the foundation of how he views his own human needs. This is juxtaposed against Wake, who chooses to keep his private sexual affairs in the light. He isn't afraid to hide it, and even later is often walked in on, whether naked next to the light or seen through a broken shingle wriggling on his bed.
Feel shame when you lie with a woman.
I ain't ashamed of nothing.
As Foucault explains, pleasure and power do not cancel or turn back against one another. They seek out, overlap, and reinforce one another. For Wake, privacy for his bodily functions isn't needed, and sexuality is just another one of these functions. Unlike Winslow, who chooses to hide his sexuality as his first decision in the film, Wake's first action as soon as he and his employee get settled is to openly piss in the chamber pot and then stink up their shared living quarters. As mentioned earlier, I believe sound is often used as a calling card for capitalism and the various pains it causes, with this moment possibly being included in that theory, but I digress.
Goddamn farts!
But Wake's privacy is needed for his tools. Wake's privacy is more important for maintaining his status as a superior. the logbook and his keys are often either guarded by himself or locked away. Alienation as isolation. He is isolated among his contemporaries, by truth and by his art, but with this consolation in his pursuits, that they will draw all men sooner or later. For all men live by truth and stand in need of expression. In love, in art, in avarice, in politics, in labor, and games, we study to utter our painful secret, that man is only half himself, the other half is his expression. Emerson, the poet. 4 weeks on a distant island with questionable stores, a rundown living quarters, and a man you will eventually describe as a goddamn no-account drunken son of a bitch bastard liar. Sounds like hell on earth. The moldy water that Wakes so smugly allows Winslow to drink represents something more than a gag. It amplifies the sense of isolation they are in, prior to the weather changing and the ship back to civilization ever arriving. Only to be indefinitely surrounded by undrinkable seawater, unsanitary drinking water, and alcohol. The isolation of the lighthouse saturates Winslow in every respect, which is what makes the situation so devastating, because beyond how physically isolating the very island the lighthouse sits on is, there's also no hope of eating alone, of sleeping alone, of being alone, but still the isolation settles in because you feel your loneliest knowing that your only company is that of a loathsome man who controls your paycheck, and that is true isolation. Viewers are invited to feel this isolation and company from the very beginning. The first clear shot of Wake and Winslow is almost framed like a vacation photo. Winslow looks directly into the camera before stepping into the lighthouse quarters, whereas Wake is preoccupied with the arrival and never looks at the viewers. Having Winslow look into the camera was an interesting narrative choice, as it invites the audience into his life to experience this journey with him. And it makes viewers feel just as isolated and ignored and disgusted as Winslow is. But it also positions Winslow as the one who the viewers sympathize with the most. I argue that the emphasis on isolation in this film plays a part in exhibiting the Marxist idea of alienation. The definition of alienation in this context is the division of oneself from the value of their own labor, their own self, and their own worth. This alienation is essential to the efficiency of a capitalistic society. Karl Marx, in Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844, asks rhetorically, what then constitutes the alienation of labor? He goes on to answer, first, the fact that labor is external to the worker, i.e., it does not belong to his essential being, that in his work, therefore, he does not affirm himself, but denies himself, does not feel content, but unhappy, does not develop freely his physical and mental energy, but mortifies his body and ruins his mind. The worker, therefore, only feels himself outside his work, and in his work feels outside himself. He is at home when he is working, and when he is working, he is not at home. His labor is therefore not voluntary, but coerced. It is forced labor. It is therefore not the satisfaction of a need. It is merely a means to satisfy needs external to it. Its alien character emerges clearly in the fact that as soon as no physical or other compulsion exists, labor is shunned like the plague. Marx finally determines that with alienation, people reluctantly resort to soothing themselves by tending to their animalistic needs. As a result, therefore, man, the worker, no longer feels himself to be freely active in any but his animal functions, eating, drinking, procreating, and at most in his dwelling and in dressing up, etc. And in his human functions, he no longer feels himself to be anything but an animal. What is animal becomes human, and what is human becomes animal. And this idea is clear in the lighthouse. Winslow is beaten into submission and stripped to his barest needs of survival, leaving behind his dignity and his morals, turning to binge drinking with his boss, a man he hates, or furiously masturbating in his limited downtime. Obeying God, being a dog. Raising himself to titanic heights, man fights for and achieves his own culture, and he compels the gods to ally themselves with him because, in his very own wisdom, he holds existence and its limits in his hands. Nietzsche, Ungotes, Prometheus. Marx's concept of alienation, leading to animalism for the workers, poses the question of what it means for the boss figure. The play on words, God versus dog, seems to be a reach, but I found myself mixing up Defoe's character, his last name, with Wick instead of Wake, often in my notes. Now, granted, I do have a problem with auditory processing, but I feel like something has to be said of the slant rhyme-esque nature of having a wiki named Wake, and that perhaps I was not to be alone in this confusion. Perhaps it was meant to lead me to this comical discovery. So leaning into this idea that the heavy themes of being a god and being a dog, I learned that they coincided much more than I anticipated. Winslow often flaunts his understanding and devotion to deities and their mythology, and weaponizes his beliefs against Winslow.
Died. Went mad he did. Raving about sirens, merfolk, bad omens and the like. In the end, weren't no more sense left in him than an end's tooth. He believed that there was some enchantment in the light. He notioned that St. Elmo had cast the very fire into it. Salvation, said he.
Tall tales.
Tall tales, only when the boss agrees to it. Otherwise, they are meant to be serious.
Bad luck to kill a seabird.
More tall tales.
Bad luck to kill a seabird. You're shivering. You're so mad, you know not up from down.
Winslow's first major confrontation with Wake revolves around a floor not clean to Wake's standards, which are impossibly high it seems. In this conversation, Wake calls Winslow a dog twice, and each time Winslow gets progressively more contrary.
Swept twice over.
Ye lying dog. Swab dog. Swab.
This becomes Winslow's word against Wake's, and on that island, God wins.
Oh, them nails sparkle like a sperm whale's pecker, and then carpenter the whole light station back together from scrap, and then do it all over again. You'll do it! And by God and by golly, you'll do it, smiling lad, 'cause you like it. You like it 'cause I says you will.
According to Emerson, poetry is not the devil's wine, but God's wine. And there's something to be said of the Melvillian-esque poetics of Wake's outbursts. Wake's inclination to the grand and whimsical mimics the fantastical gestures of deities. The phrase "by God and by golly" stands out to me, as this isn't the only time Wake hearkens God onto his side. Deign to save our suppliant soul loosely means hoping God takes pity upon them and saves their humble souls, if they are to die at sea. This contrasts starkly to asking upon God to make sure the keeper's quarters are clean. This difference creates the idea that Wake has a hidden power, an agreement with God or the gods that will have his side, and that makes his curses that much more powerful, as if there's a truth to them. Shortly after his initial poetic berating of Winslow, Wake compares his logbook to gospel. Wake has proven himself as godlike by aligning himself with power. And according to Kierkegaard, as the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy explains, it is not enough simply for God to issue a command. We need to hear and obey, but obedience is not straightforward. We can obey willingly or begrudgingly. We can refuse altogether. We can be selectively deaf or be so filled with our egotistical desires that we are altogether deaf to our duties. In order to obey, we first need to cultivate faith, since obedience to a divine command is nonsense unless we at least believe the command has come from God. Wake needs his employees to obey with earnest, and Winslow, he is God-fearing, as he admits to Wake.
I'm God-fearing, if that's what you're asking.
And while his obedience is begrudging, he is loyal. In the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844, Marx describes the relationship of work and worship. The more man puts into God, the less he retains in himself. The worker puts his life into the object, but now his life no longer belongs to him, but to the object. Hence, the greater this activity, the greater is the worker's lack of objects. Whatever the product of his labor is, he is not. Therefore, the greater this product, the less is he himself. However, the trade-off of not participating in capitalism and not producing labor is being accused of doing evil, a statement that Wake gives credence to, as he says this of the sailors who found themselves without work on a sea journey.
Doldrums, eviler than the devil. Boredom, makes men to villains.
The phrase idle hands or the devil's workshop is a common proverb that supports the Christian ideal of labor. To work hard is to be godly, to be told to work and obey is to be a dog, and to not work is to be the devil. Consequently, capitalism pits people against each other, shaming them into only seeing two options: to be God or to be a dog.
Swab, dog. Swab.
Marx delineates the modern capitalist class system into three categories: bourgeois, proletariat, and the petite bourgeoisie. Soren Kierkegaard explained that the petite bourgeoisie, or petit bourgeois, which is loosely described as the non-industrial bourgeois, is filled with spiritlessness. But with petty bourgeois vulgarity and triviality, which also essentially lack possibility, the case is somewhat different. The petty bourgeois is spiritless, while the determinists and the fatalists are in a state of spiritual despair. But spiritlessness, too, is despair. The petty bourgeois lacks any spiritual characteristic and is absorbed in the probable, in which the possible finds its tiny place. Thus, he lacks possibility in the way needed to become aware of God. Devoid of imagination as the petty bourgeois always is, he lives within a certain orbit of trivial experience as to how things come about, what is possible, what usually happens, no matter whether he is a tapster or a prime minister. This is the way in which the petty bourgeois has lost himself and God. For to be aware of himself and of God, a man's imagination must whirl him up higher than the dank air of the probable, and must tear him out of that. Individuality in religion. The religious world is but the reflex of the real world, and for a society based upon the production of commodities, in which the producers in general enter into social relations with one another by treating their products as commodities and values, whereby they reduce their individual private labor to the standard homogeneous human labor. For such a society, Christianity with its cultus, worship of abstract man, more especially in its bourgeois developments, belief in a supreme being while rejecting the supernatural and focusing on reason and ethical conduct, is the most fitting form of religion. Karl Marx and Frederick Engels in Das Kapital. Individuality in religion becomes impossible within a capitalist society. As Marx and Engels in Das Kapital explain that whereas the more ancient religions believed, according to Epicurus, an ancient Greek philosopher, that gods had nothing to do with human affairs, and that these ancient social organisms of production are, as compared with bourgeois society, extremely simple and transparent. While Wake regularly harks upon the old gods as a sailor often would, he habitually swaps between those deities and the Christian deity.
Let Neptune strike ye dead, Winslow! Hark! Hark! Triton! Hark!
During the late 19th century, Soren Kierkegaard was tackling the idea of maintaining individuality in Christianity while social class structures of his time were shifting. According to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the task was most difficult for the well-educated, since prevailing educational and cultural institutions tend to produce stereotyped members of the crowd rather than to allow individuals to discover their own unique identities. This problem was compounded by the fact that Denmark had recently and very rapidly been transformed from a feudal society into a capitalist society. Kierkegaard advocated for the concept of the single individual versus the crowd, which would force people back onto their own resources, to take responsibility for their own existential choices, and to become who they are beyond their socially imposed identities. For Kierkegaard, the importance of individuality was reliant for worship. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy explains that Theodor W. Adorno, a Marxist and a German philosopher after World War II, argued that Kierkegaard's philosophy ultimately reflects only the bourgeois interior of his time, and that Kierkegaard falls into the idealism he sought to escape because, like the existentialists, he fails to follow a concrete historical dialectic. Kierkegaard fails to understand the self in terms of its concrete historical situation, and despite his best intentions, creates a self-contradictory system of existence. For me, Kierkegaard falls short of the understanding that the reality of the worker is to gain in capitalism, one must lose their individuality. And if Kierkegaard's theory on religion is correct, the worker can never worship fully. Young versus old. Life can only be understood backward, but it must be lived forwards. Soren Kierkegaard. Upon my first viewing of The Lighthouse, I found myself connecting the most with Winslow. Why wouldn't I? He's presented with having the most reason for complaint, to be sympathized with the most because of his terrible boss and his grueling work, and his sad little dream of just earning enough money to settle down, and get the privilege of being left alone and unbothered. But upon another viewing, I realized that Wake wasn't entirely free of sympathy. I spoke earlier about how Winslow looks into the camera briefly, allowing for the audience to connect with him most immediately prior to anything of consequence happening in the film. But Winslow in the story, despite being representative of the overworked employee, often takes over that narrative. But is Winslow that reliable of a narrator? Not to mention that he watched a man die, a former boss of his, who called him a dog, and then stole his identity. He is often caught lying or casting blame without evidence, so he isn't an innocent character. I was first clued in on this discrepancy on my second viewing after the wind changed. I found it interesting in the scene that Winslow tactfully avoids answering Wake after he killed the seagull, a secret he meant to keep from the wiki.
Something's stirring in you. You're getting off this rock tomorrow, Winslow. Don't start grudging me now.
No, sir.
Keeping secrets, are you?
Could just use a hand with them boards is all.
Winslow's live admission indicates a willingness to withhold information from his boss, and to take the risk on just how true Wake's talk of sea curses and bad luck really is. Another inaccuracy of truth was when Winslow expresses his suspicions of Wake's life story, whereas at this point, Winslow was the only one with a known motive to lie about his life. Several times, Winslow accuses Wake of lying, especially about his days at sea and how he got a stiff leg.
And a pretty lass she were, taking off her bonnet. But as I says, I broke me leg and banged myself all up. 'Twas to a nuns' hospital. All them nuns were Catholics, I tell you.
There were no real discrepancies in his story.
And 'twas that scurvy what left me locked ever since.
I thought you said you broke it.
Hey?
The leg. Catholic nuns and such like.
You must have misheard.
He never proclaimed to have a stiff leg after his encounter with the nuns. I became suspicious of Winslow, and my suspicion grew when a slightly off wording came to light when he was describing his past work.
Can't find a post I can take a real shine to, so I keep moving along. I ain't the kind to look back what's behind him, see?
Winslow spoke of working multiple jobs, but only truly mentions his work in lumber. It makes me question how many fresh starts he had. How many started with a dead boss and a stolen name? Was this moment just to make viewers sympathize with him, making the assumption that they could have worked the same job as him? Or is there something more sinister? Suspicions aside, what we know is what we saw, and when Winslow reads out the logbook detailing the misconduct.
Assistant slept late. Worked below some. Attitude. Hostile. Assistant missing. Given to habitual self-abuse and supply chain. Drunk on duty. Assault. Theft. Recommend severance without pay.
Is Wake actually wrong? I was shocked at first at the betrayal, but at second glance, I asked myself, and you and I both know that Winslow did all these things. We saw it. But why is Wake still the villain at this moment? Because Winslow had trusted Wake to be his friend and confidant on this island, to not rat him out like this, for Wake to be a friend and not a boss. But he is a boss, and a boss he is.
Now, I'm a wiki, and a wiki I is. And I'm damn well wedded to this here light. And she's been a finer, truer, quieter wife than any alive-blooded woman.
Nonetheless, I see Wake as an older Winslow, a man just wanting to settle down who has all his dreams swept away with the dirt on the deck he swapped too many times at the behest of a power-drunk boss. Thomas Wake finds identity in capitalism just as much as Winslow. He too fell for the trap.
Miss it? Ain't nothing. what could touch it. But they can't be dragging the old stump about. Nay, not worth the trouble.
The man left his wife and his kids for his job, for capitalism, and when capitalism said he was too disabled to work at sea, he left that job too.
Selfish bastard! Keep it all to yourself. You left your old lady, your children, for what?
Thomas Wake was depicted with having a chest tattoo of a fully rigged ship. According to Naval History and Heritage Command, a now antiquated meaning of that particular tattoo indicates that the sailor had rounded Cape Horn. He did swab those decks, just like young Tommy. Now, begrudged by capitalism, Wake has become who he hated, a power-hungry boss.
Yea, handsome lad with eyes bright as a lady. Come to this rock, playing the tough. You make me laugh with your false grum. Ye pretended to some mystery in your quietudes, but there ain't no mystery. You're an open book. A picture, says I. A painted actress screaming in the footlights. A bitch what wants to be coveted for nothing but being born, crying about the silver spoon what should have been yours. Now looky here. Crying. Boo. Boo.
Ultimately, Wake and Winslow want the same thing.
Same old boring story, eh?
So when Winslow gets the upper hand, does he end the cycle?
What up, old dog? Polish your breastwork. Oh.
Crisis of culture. Going back to the beginning, once Winslow and Wake make it to land, there are two unnamed men leaving the lighthouse. They are holding a trunk together, carrying it as equals. I argue that this film offers two supposed outs of this situation. Either the two find each other as equals and leave the island alive, or they could try to hoard the elusive salvation Wake says that the previous keeper found in the light for themselves, casting the other way at the risk of losing it all. Salvation, though, is enticing. For Marx, the alienation of the worker creates a hostility, something foreign that he must reject. The alienation of the worker in his product means not only that his labor becomes an object, an external existence, but that it exists outside him, independently, as something alien to him, and that it becomes a power of its own confronting him. It means that the life which he has conferred on the object confronts him as something hostile and alien. It allows the worker to reject his labors, to throw away his hard work for the sake of gaining something else, something with misplaced value, much like the light. The freedom to go against society, to not pursue the light, this immediate salvation, is within oneself, if you can reach it. Adorno, a post-World War II Marxist, says of the idea of free will. In this age of universal social repression, the picture of freedom against society lives in the crushed, abused individual's features alone. When that freedom will hide out at any moment in history cannot be decreed once for all. Freedom turns concrete in the changing forms of repression, as resistance to repression. There has been as much free will as there were men with the will to be free. Perhaps in these last moments, Winslow was reaching for freedom in the wrong place. Patrick Brantlinger explains that unlike most Marxists, Adorno has little faith in the proletariat as the agent of revolution. He sees the masses as having been bought off by the mass media and by the forces of reaction. Adorno appears to place his faith in the historical efficacy of negativity, but without a clear historical agent, such negativity seems to be a little more than the capacity for radical criticism inherent in the philosophical tradition. It is important to note that Adorno, during World War II, was removed from his German university for teaching leftist ideals. Brantlinger continues that it is also evident that Adorno is not a classicist in the straightforward sense of believing that past culture can help cure present social injustice. Past culture is instead the source of present injustice. Brantlinger explains that Adorno still believes that change could be achieved, and at present, these forces radiate unconsciously from the oppressed and deluded masses themselves. Still the agent of liberation, no matter how monstrously distorted their faces have grown. This is not to say that the culture itself is not fated to decline. Self-destruction is built directly in the system of domination. Self-destruction of the system lies in its contradictions. Brantlinger certifies that Adorno thinks Spengler has shown once and for all that culture cannot be the solution of the crisis of culture. Adorno, in response to Spengler's Decline of the West, argues that, more strikingly than anyone else, Spengler has demonstrated how the rawness of culture again and again drives it to decay, and how, as form and order, culture is affiliated with that blind domination which, through permanent crises, is always prone to annihilate itself and its victims. According to Brantlinger, the mechanism of liberation must come from some source other than culture. Did Winslow have any choice in the matter of not allowing himself to be tempted by the light? Would culture be able to change? To have the out where he and Wake walk out of there, each hand grasping the handle of the same trunk? According to Brantlinger, Adorno's thinking becomes apocalyptic to the degree that he conceives of all history as domination, to be broken only by a future revolution that, because of its uniqueness and improbability, acquires the character of a miracle, a judgment day that will bring history itself to a close. Conclusion.
Should pale death with treble dread make the ocean caves our bed, God, who hears the surges roll, deign to save our suppliant soul.
Treble dread means 3 times as much dread. I wanted to determine what causes threefold dread. Why 3? Emerson, in his essay The Poet, which dissects the role of the poet in society, describes the 3 children of the universe. Emerson defines the 3 children as the knower, the doer, and the sayer. Emerson claims these 3 idols appear time after time in our history. He says that the 3 children of the universe can also be described as the 3 Roman gods, Jove, Pluto, and Neptune. His other explanation of these repeating roles best connected with me, which are the lovers of truth, good, and beauty, in that order. Neptune is the Roman god of the sea, and fittingly, the role of the poet, for Emerson, is Neptune, who is also identified as the lover of beauty. I feel that then the poet in the Lighthouse is evidently Thomas Wake, the devoted sailor who hearkens upon his deities to stand by with him. Though if Wake has a place among the 3 children, where does Winslow stand? In the case of Winslow, I would argue that he takes the place of Pluto. Pluto, as explained by Emerson, is the Roman god of the dead and ruler of the underworld. For me, the connection of the dead revolves most around Winslow, as he brings death upon his previous employer, then the seagull, then Wake, and finally upon himself. However, while Pluto is surrounded by death, Emerson also aligns that Roman god with the lover of good. I believe that while Winslow is ultimately guilty of a number of crimes, he is still aligned with good in the film, despite failing to be good on multiple actions. His motive is to do good, to be a good worker, to have a fresh start. This claim of mine is further supported by the fact that Wake is just as inconsistent with his love. He represents the lover of beauty, as does Emerson's poet, but he forsakes his muse, the sea, for the light, for capitalism. A light that is ultimately without any value besides that which he and Winslow placed upon it. This love for capitalism placed above their true loves is precisely why neither of them could be the lovers of truth. They both turn away from truth to feed into this capitalistic idea of being able to obtain power and salvation, this falsehood that they believe in. This leaves the role of the final 3rd child of the universe to be filled. The cast of the Lighthouse is clearly pretty limited, but I believe this is where the one-eyed seagull appears in this analysis. I believe that the one-eyed seagull represents the lover of truth, who throughout Act 1 tries to guide Winslow to the truth. The seagull appears first before Wake berates Winslow about the floors, then knocks at the window before Winslow explores the lighthouse, and then after Winslow fell while whitewashing, and then is finally dismissed and betrayed. If seagulls hold the souls of dead sailors, then perhaps the previous one-eyed keeper that died under Wake's care likely experienced some of the very same things that Winslow did as an employee under Wake. This would explain the appearances of the seagull as an informed warning rather than a strictly visual metaphor. The one-eyed seagull became the lover of truth, Jove, god of gods, because the previous keeper did reach salvation of another sort. Once he learned the truth of the light, that it is nothing, all he could do was warn whoever took his place. So why is Young in hysterics at the end? Salvation in its supposed form doesn't exist. There's no achieving capitalism, winning capitalism. Knowing your lot is how capitalism wants you to be. There's no tricking the system. Keeping the light for yourself does not grant you any magical salvation. And anyone else duped by this belief are also entranced by the system. It is all tall tales. Should pale death, with treble dread, make the ocean caves our bed. God who hearst the surges roll, deign to save our suppliant soul. Hey there, thank you for watching. I'm really overheated in the sun. Oh my god. There were some topics that I thought I missed. I think you could explore the whole noises things I mentioned, of how it can represent capitalism showing up, and the knocking that the seagull does on the window. I think that could go into it. I think I should have explored how young and old represent each other a little more. Basically, what I believe is that they're different stages of the same life. I don't necessarily believe that they are the same person. They could be. But I definitely think it's kind of like a young person looking at their older version and being disappointed, and an older version of themselves being able to look back at themselves and being like, you're kind of an idiot. And I feel like that is a valid interpretation of young and old, but I didn't want to get into it too much because I thought it took away from the whole Marxist reading, even though it could very well have a Marxist reading. But there's so much that you could delve into with this story, but a big part of what I wanted to delve into with this reading, this analysis, is that the story is set in right when Marxism started coming into the light, and I feel like it's important to think about how work is represented in the film and why it was chosen to be in that time period. And I feel like it's important to explore that. There's also a lot of work you could do talking about the gods and the Prometheus and Proteus and all of them. And I delve into it a little bit. I would like to see more readings on it. I'm sure there's plenty already, but I haven't had the time to look into all of them, or a good portion of them. Acolytes of Horror inspired a lot of this. He does a pretty good video on the Lighthouse. A lot of it's inspired by that. Obviously, there's some differences, but he does some really good work. So check him out. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed this first video. There will be more to come. And hopefully it can be as fun as this. But yeah, make sure to look out for that, like and subscribe. You can check out my articles on my website at itsforestier.com. And if you like my makeup work, I do a lot more work at my drag page, Forest Kin. It's on the website as well. But yeah, see you later. Thank you for watching. This is a Q-tip and a piece of paper rolled up. So, don't smoke, kids.